Imagine trying to run a marathon with weighted boots. That's what it feels like when your brain is locked into old loops. It's not laziness, it's mental resistance dragging on every step. In this activation, you'll experience one small but powerful shift you can actually feel within 24 hours. A reset that shows you freedom doesn't require a giant leap. Recent research on the attention economy warns that doom scrolling and endless low-quality content drain focus, especially for young adults. That's why this video goes deeper, into career, relationships, location, and creative blocks, so you see exactly where stuckness hides and how to release it. The hidden weight of stuckness. Most people mistake being stuck for procrastination or low motivation, but the truth runs deeper. Stuckness feels like carrying an invisible load that slows down thought, lessens energy, and shapes behavior before you even notice. You might still get tasks done, hit deadlines, or keep life moving, but inside, there's a sensation of moving through water with every step. That weight isn't about weak character. It's the silent pressure of modern systems on the mind, body, and emotions. This is visible in the workplace. Gallup's latest data shows global employee engagement has stagnated. Only about 23% of employees are engaged, while around 62% are not engaged. Nearly 52% say they're watching for or actively seeking a new job. These aren't outliers, they reflect a widespread sense of disconnection. And while remote work was meant to restore balance, it came with new costs. Gallup reports that roughly 25% of fully remote workers feel lonely, compared with 16% of fully on-site employees. Travel perk and buffers research further note that burnout and digital communication strain have grown in remote structures. In other words, many of the changes meant to bring relief instead shifted stuckness into a more hidden form. To understand this hidden weight, picture the mind like a computer pushed beyond its limits, too many tabs open at once. Nothing is broken, yet everything slows. Every unfinished task, each lingering notification, and every mental loop creates background drag. Most people don't see this energy drain, but they feel its effect when they try to push harder and discover there's no fuel left to summon. From there, the blame usually turns inward. People tell themselves they lack discipline or need extra willpower. But forcing more effort without removing the load only deepens the cycle. Like whipping a tired horse instead of lightening the cart, we mistake exhaustion for failure and miss the real problem. Energy spread thin across too many layers of stuckness. Those layers tend to fall into three categories. The mental layer is the inner monologue that repeats delays and doubts. I'll start tomorrow, or it won't make any difference. The emotional layer is the undertone, Sunday night dread before the week begins, or the dull emptiness that shadows repetitive work. And the environmental layer is the structure surrounding you, objects, spaces, and cues that set certain moods by default. Together, these form a net so constant it starts to feel like simple reality. Neuroscience helps explain why it feels so deeply ingrained. Research on neuroplasticity shows that thought patterns you use repeatedly create stronger pathways, while unused pathways weaken. This process, called neural pruning, makes familiar loops easier to access and alternative options harder to reach. Over time, repeating the same internal story wires the brain for sameness, not change. Add the multitasking demands of the attention economy, which fragment focus and increase error rates, and the hidden weight compounds. This is not about a single age group or career stage. Students stuck at their desks, mid-career professionals, and even retirees without daily structure all describe the same subdued heaviness. More tools, more flexibility, even more options often leave people scattered instead of liberated. The overload makes even small choices harder to act on, and the weight feels like it's part of your personality. But it isn't who you are. It's pressure absorbed from repetition and environment. Naming this for what it is becomes the first step toward loosening its grip. Once you see that your energy isn't missing but tied up in mental clutter, emotional tone, and environmental triggers, you realize you don't need to become someone new. You need space. Each time you notice one of these layers, a habitual phrase in your head, a subtle dread before a task, or a physical setup that primes distraction, you can lighten the system. Even small changes open back energy that otherwise calcifies into the sense of being stuck. The key shift is accuracy over self-criticism. Willpower plays its role, but only after you've reduced the drag. No runner adds stones to their shoes before a marathon. They remove weight to free energy for the actual race. Clearing just one mental loop, adjusting one environmental detail, or naming one emotional undertone changes how much friction you feel. And this is why so many interventions fall short. Productivity apps, motivational videos, perks at work, they usually aim at the mind alone. But a thought can't sustain itself if it's pulled back by emotional undertones or environmental habits. For change to stick, the layers named earlier must be visible at once. Stuckness is rarely one thing. It's the constant combined pull of three. Recognizing that is not the end, it's the starting line. Awareness cracks the illusion that you're missing something internal. It shows instead that your system has been reinforced to hold you in place. Once the mechanism is named, you already stand outside it enough to begin adjusting. That clarity is the earliest form of forward movement. And yet there's a question that lingers. If freedom and lightness feel so inherently good, why would the brain cling so tightly to sameness? Why would it resist that release so fiercely? Why your brain loves to keep you stuck? Your brain holds a powerful bias. It prefers familiarity over novelty. Not because you're weak or resistant, but because your internal wiring prizes efficiency above all else. Repeating the same thought or behavior takes less energy than forging a new one, so when faced with change, the brain instinctively leans toward what it already knows. That means even opportunities that could expand your life often trigger hesitation rather than action. At the core of this bias are neural pathways. Each repeated thought or action creates stronger connections, like trails pressed into the earth. Over years, those trails widen into highways. The implication is simple. The more often you run the same loop, the more automatic it becomes. You don't have to choose it, it chooses you. A familiar routine may not make you happy, but it spares the brain from burning extra calories. For someone trying to shift a career path, start a business, or break a cycle, that preference for energy efficiency becomes the quiet anchor holding them in place. Supporting this process are what neuroscientists call the brain's default networks. These clusters of regions light up when the mind wanders, reflects, or slips into narrative mode. Studies on multitasking, like those summarized in the Multi-Costs of Multitasking research, show how readily the brain falls back into habit-heavy modes of thought when attention loosens. The design is not malicious, it's survival. These networks recycle the most familiar narratives because reusing material consumes less effort. If you've often thought, "I never follow through," or "this is just how my life goes," those stories become more available than alternatives. The consequence is that change feels unnatural, even when it's healthier. Then there is pruning. Throughout life, the brain trims away unused connections, like clearing out tangled brush. Neural pruning is normal and even useful. It streamlines mental resources toward what you use most. But in cycles of repetition, that efficiency comes with a cost. Unrehearsed possibilities, like choosing a new place to live, exploring a new skill, or imagining an alternate career, start to feel inaccessible. They haven't vanished, but the channels connecting to them weaken. The hopeful news is that pruning goes both ways. Neuroplasticity research shows the brain grows new pathways when new actions are repeated consistently. That means even if years of sameness have narrowed options, they can be widened again. This pruning is reversible. Consistent new actions grow new pathways. The combination of pathways, default networks, and pruning makes the brain incredibly skilled at pulling you back into old grooves. What feels like personal hesitation is often structural inertia. But reframing this is important. Resistance doesn't mean you're incapable. It means your system is running a program designed to minimize disruption. Even our ancestors benefited from this wiring. Sticking with reliable food sources or proven routines increased survival rates. Today, though, the same mechanisms keep people looped in unfulfilling jobs, drained by environments, or trapped in repetitive habits that no longer serve them. Understanding this creates leverage. Once you know your hesitation is circuitry, you can stop equating it with failure of character. For example, when you catch yourself recycling the same excuse or procrastination loop, you can pause long enough to label it. My brain is conserving energy. Naming it reduces its authority. Suddenly, you aren't laziness incarnate, you're just noticing the default tendency at work. That small shift makes it possible to intervene instead of collapsing back into the rut. What does intervention look like in practical terms? It doesn't require dramatic reinvention. It requires repetition of something new. Each time you practice a fresh routine, whether writing for 10 minutes daily, restructuring a workspace to signal focus, or adjusting sleep patterns, you're feeding underused pathways. At first, they feel awkward. With consistency, they stabilize. Over time, the formerly entrenched grooves weaken, and the newer ones become easier routes. Momentum accumulates, not overnight but predictably. One lighthearted way to visualize this is to think of your brain like a playlist that defaults to the same track on repeat. It's less about taste and more about convenience. The brain would rather replay an old song than load a new one. The only way to shift the playlist isn't to criticize the brain, but to add new tracks until they become just as familiar. Initially, they sound strange, but after enough replays, they fit right into the mix. This perspective resets how you approach getting unstuck. Instead of wasting energy on self-blame, you invest it in designing deliberate interruptions. That could mean changing your environment in a small way, creating cues that reinforce a new habit, or intentionally practicing novelty, even when it feels uncomfortable. Awareness turns the brain from adversary into collaborator. By treating resistance as wiring, not weakness, you reshape your role, from passenger of habit to active programmer of routine. What's crucial to remember is that nothing about these grooves is permanent. They may be deep, but they aren't fixed in stone. Every brain, regardless of age or circumstance, maintains plasticity, the ability to shift with input and practice. That's the ultimate paradox. The same brain that locks you into familiar grooves is also the one that can release you through repetition of new ones. Recognizing this changes the narrative of effort. Instead of thinking, change feels hard because I'm broken, you replace it with, change feels hard because I'm rewiring. And when you hold that frame, the experience of resistance itself takes on new meaning. You're no longer trapped by the story that sameness equals safety. You start spotting the subtle moments when your system tries to steer you toward the familiar, and instead of following without question, you pause. That pause cracks the loop. Step by step, you create space for new grooves to take hold. Now the real question emerges. If your brain so strongly prefers the familiar, how do entire lives become shaped by that tendency without you even noticing? One answer lies in how these grooves don't just shape choices, they filter perception itself, narrowing what options even appear visible. The quantum trap of "this is just how life is." This narrowing shows up most clearly in what we'll call the quantum trap of "this is just how life is." At first glance, it doesn't feel like a trap at all. It feels like acceptance, like settling into the structure life gave you. Yet beneath the surface, it functions as a quiet mechanism of stuckness. Over time, you begin to believe that what you see is all there is, that other possibilities might exist for someone else, but not for you. The trap isn't built out of circumstance, it's built out of perception. Here's the core idea in simple terms. In quantum physics, particles exist in multiple potential states until observed. Once observed, they collapse into a single outcome. Now apply that as a metaphor to the mind. At any moment, your life contains multiple possible paths, new directions, different choices, unexplored opportunities. But under pressure, perception collapses. Instead of seeing a spectrum of options, you reduce it all to one conclusion. This is just how things are. It's not that other choices stopped existing. It's that they slipped out of view. What remains is one narrow storyline, repeated so often it starts to masquerade as truth. Psychologists often describe this as cognitive narrowing, where the brain filters information down to what feels familiar or safe. The important point is that those filters don't erase the world, they shrink what you notice. The practical effect is powerful. A job that leaves you drained no longer feels optional, it feels permanent. A relationship that no longer supports your growth feels inescapable. Even your physical surroundings can glue into place. The brain's collapse of perception makes change look not just difficult, but impossible. This collapse is reinforced by environment and culture. Workplaces encourage it through promises of stability. Families reinforce it with stories about risk being dangerous. Media magnifies it with endless examples of endurance, characters who survive by staying put, who are praised for adapting instead of venturing. Over time, these narratives feed into the same outcome. The bubble of perceived inevitability thickens. Inside that bubble, imagination shrinks. Outside it, you stop looking. Repetition makes the bubble thicker still. Each cycle of the same routine teaches the brain that stability equals safety. When a new possibility does appear, someone changing careers midlife, uprooting their location, or starting again from nothing, the bubble shields you with the phrase, "That works for them, not for me." Perception collapse doesn't delete the evidence. It simply edits the meaning so the story of inevitability survives. We can see the same mechanism playing out in digital culture. Constant exposure to algorithmic feeds trains attention to recycle what's already chosen, narrowing imagination even further. A recent review of Brain Rot Discourse highlights how overuse of digital platforms amplifies mental fatigue and makes perception stickier, reducing openness to alternative perspectives. The mind ends up repeating old judgments the same way a feed repeats old preferences, showing you slivers of reality while hiding the rest just out of reach. The everyday result is limitation disguised as logic. Someone who longs to change work will quickly list 5 rational-sounding reasons it's impossible. The pay is uncertain, the market is unstable, their skills don't translate, moving is too expensive, or it's too late in life. Each reason has a thread of truth, which is why collapse feels convincing. But notice how each argument collapses toward the same conclusion: stay. The bubble doesn't offer balance, it edits what you can see until one answer remains. Meanwhile, other truths stay hidden. Skills can be retrained. Markets evolve. Satisfaction often outweighs financial fear across a lifetime, but unless you question the lens itself, those truths don't enter consciousness. That's why this trap can feel heavier than circumstance. Collapse does not tell you, you have options. Collapse tells you, you had options once but not anymore. And that voice, repeated long enough, becomes reality. People settle into jobs, locations, and relationships not because they actively choose them, but because the trap tells them no other field is open. And then years pass inside limitations that were never walls to begin with, they were just edits of perception. Recognizing that distinction changes things. It doesn't immediately erase the bubble, but it allows you to question it. You realize the thought, "this is just how life is not a reading of reality, it's a symptom of perception collapse. That realization softens its grip. Instead of concluding it's impossible, you can ask, what else might exist outside what I'm currently seeing? A single question cracks the surface because it destabilizes the supposed inevitability. It's important to stress, collapse itself is not failure, it's a default setting of the brain. Evolution favored repetition because familiarity increased survival. But what increased survival in the past now reduces growth in the present. The mind prefers to recycle what's already proven, which means possibility has to be practiced deliberately. Awareness gives you that option. You notice that collapse is just a filter, not evidence. And once you label it as filter, you create distance between you and the narrative it delivers. Culture still reinforces sameness, daily routines still pull you into grooves, and digital feeds still narrow attention. Yet your relationship to them shifts once you see their mechanics. You stop confusing what I see with what exists. Options don't disappear because you can't imagine them. They remain in play whether you acknowledge them or not. The quantum trap dissolves the moment you understand that collapsing perception is psychological, not absolute. The reality outside the bubble never left. It was waiting for you to turn toward it. Breaking that cycle doesn't demand massive upheaval. It starts smaller with interruptions. Each time you step outside the repeated storyline, even briefly, you remind your mind that collapse is not permanent. Trying a single new pattern, speaking with someone outside your usual circle, adjusting one element of your daily rhythm, questioning one assumption, restores possibilities to view. Small acts may not look revolutionary, but they work because they accumulate. Each serves as evidence that collapse can reverse. Over time, the bubble that once looked unbreakable reveals itself as temporary. This is the reframing that turns stuckness from an identity into a state. The trap is not the job itself, not the city, not even the relationship or the habit. The trap is the narrowed lens that convinced you those were the only routes available. Once you start to shift the lens, even by a fraction, different routes re-enter perception. You don't need to wait for a dramatic leap or some grand portal into freedom. What you need is a way to create cracks in the loop you already live. Those cracks prove that collapse has limits. They remind you momentum can start exactly where you are. And that recognition naturally leads to the next step. If possibility is hidden by collapse, not destroyed, the question becomes, how do you create consistent cracks large enough for new patterns to grow? The answer isn't sweeping reinvention. It starts much smaller, with daily micro-interruptions that slowly weaken collapse until freedom stops being a theory and starts being an experience. Breaking the loop with micro-shifts. Breaking the loop begins not with dramatic upheaval, but with something much smaller, micro-shifts. These are deliberate, repeatable interruptions of routine that retrain the brain, not through force, but through subtle pivots. The value of a micro-shift is not in its size. It's in how it sneaks past resistance and builds fresh neural pathways through repetition. Instead of trying to overhaul your entire life overnight, you focus on one small adjustment that tilts you out of autopilot. That's the power of micro-shifts. They create leverage without triggering the brain's defenses. Start with something almost invisible. Stand during one meeting instead of sitting. Neurologically, this introduces novelty into posture and movement, activating slightly different brain circuits than the slouch default. The immediate payoff is sharper engagement, a burst of alertness that keeps you from drifting. It's not about solving your career in one move. It's about inserting a cue that counters the body's signal of sameness. Another simple tactic is changing one object in your workspace. Maybe that means shifting the position of your screen, swapping the chair for 10 minutes with a stool, or moving a lamp to cast light differently. The brain links environment with behavior. By altering one small cue, you disrupt the unconscious associations wired into that space. The effect is fresh perspective, and while it feels subtle, it reminds the brain that what usually happens is not fixed law. The novelty interrupts the weight of repetition. Micro-shifts apply just as strongly to digital routines. Instead of 30 minutes of doom scrolling, take 5 of those minutes and open your Notes app. Write down 3 ideas, 3 questions worth exploring, or 3 connections you could make later. Neurologically, this exchange is crucial. Rather than passive consumption, you switch into generative mode, which stimulates different networks and reduces depletion. The immediate payoff is momentum. You walk away not drained, but with material to develop. This doesn't demand energy you don't have. It redirects energy you were already spending. Consider protecting 30 minutes for creative work each day. At first, it feels like stealing scraps of time. Yet consistency turns that small guardrail into identity. Neurologically, the repetition strengthens a new groove. The brain begins anticipating the task, preloading focus for it. The payoff is cumulative. Over weeks, those 30-minute pockets add up to entire days of returned energy. One person who tried this didn't overhaul their schedule or resign from their job. They simply carved out half an hour for art each evening. Within 2 months, they had more creative output than they'd produced in years, and more importantly, they began describing themselves differently, not as someone stuck, but as someone who creates. That identity shift grew from a micro-shift, practiced steadily. Another small but potent move is sending one outreach message this week. It could be an email, a text, or a brief note on a platform you rarely use. Why does it work? Because the brain's social circuits light up when connection takes place, releasing a short-lived dopamine boost. The payoff isn't in whether someone replies immediately. The payoff is in signaling to yourself that you're capable of initiating instead of waiting. That simple act weakens the passive storyline that says change must arrive from outside. At first glance, micro-shifts look too trivial to matter, but triviality is what allows them to bypass resistance. The nervous system doesn't flare into threat mode over standing in a meeting or moving a lamp, yet repetition makes these small adjustments transformative. Each time you apply one, you reduce rigidity and expand your sense of what's possible. Over time, these micro-interruptions accumulate until the loop that once felt immovable begins to weaken. The mind often insists that real change must be dramatic, quitting, relocating, reinventing everything at once. But the reality is that consistent, micro-scale interruptions build the foundation for large transitions later. 1% a day compounds. And when practiced over months, these shifts aren't just habits, they reshape identity. You begin to see yourself as someone who experiments, someone capable of choosing novelty, someone no longer bound to the default loop. The beauty of micro-shifts is that they're available to everyone. They don't depend on wealth, credentials, or grand plans. They depend only on willingness to alter one detail and repeat it. A standing meeting, a repositioned object, a burst of creative time, a redirected 5 minutes on your phone, a small act of connection. They're simple, but precise. They teach the brain that sameness is not inevitable, that possibility is already woven into the smallest details of your routines. Here's a challenge to anchor this. Choose one micro-shift now. Not tomorrow, not later, right now. Pick one of these examples and commit. And as the next step, type that choice into the comments. This isn't about accountability to others, it's about declaring to yourself in written form that a fresh pattern has begun. That simple act of stating it out loud cements the shift, turning possibility into practice. As these micro-adjustments stack, they begin to alter not only what you do, but how your brain allocates energy. Each tiny choice primes neural circuits differently, each new pattern cues novelty, and each consistent act builds reinforcement. The result is momentum that feels natural instead of forced. And when momentum returns, the weight of stuckness starts to loosen. That momentum is not a vague idea. It directly affects how the brain regulates focus. And focus, more than anything, is what determines whether new patterns gain traction or collapse under distraction. To see how this works, we need to turn to the cycles inside the brain itself, because they dictate why attention feels so fragile and how easily it fragments in modern life. Rewiring productivity with neuroscience hacks. Rewiring productivity starts with understanding how your brain actually allocates energy. It isn't built for endless concentration. It works in rhythms, with peaks and troughs shaped by neurochemistry. When you align your habits with these cycles instead of fighting against them, focus no longer feels like brute effort. It feels more like flow returning on its own. One key cycle involves dopamine, the brain's reward signal. Dopamine doesn't rise when you complete a task, it spikes when you anticipate one. That surge is what pulls you forward. But when anticipation gets fragmented, checking messages, scanning feeds, opening half a dozen tabs, you scatter that chemistry. Motivation drains into fragments instead of fueling a clear direction. The result isn't lack of ability, it's short-circuited momentum. To conserve dopamine's pull, direct it into one named task at a time. Even something as simple as open this document and work for 25 minutes reignites the anticipatory loop and restores clarity. Another hidden cost is task switching. Neuroscience research shows that each time you switch tasks, your brain keeps part of its attention on the one you just left. That lingering attachment is known as switch cost. Studies cited by News Medical and summarized in the multi-costs of multitasking research reveal that frequent switching can cut productivity by up to 40%, while reducing speed and accuracy across every task attempted. In practical terms, writing while checking email while glancing at texts feels doable, but the chemistry proves otherwise. Each switch jams your circuits with residue, like leaving multiple apps refreshing at once. The energy drain is invisible until you notice the haze afterward. The environment layers distraction on top of this. One pop-up notification, a buzz from another room, or a quick scroll doesn't feel costly by itself. But each break fragments rhythm and forces the brain to restart. Instead of sinking into a groove, you spend the day rebooting. It's like trying to cook a complex recipe while the stove keeps shutting off. Ingredients never fully combine. Where most people blame lack of discipline, the deeper reality is an interrupted rhythm that the chemistry never has time to stabilize. This is where neuroscience-backed hacks give leverage. Time blocking is one of the simplest. A contained window of focus, whether 25 minutes Pomodoro style or a longer ultradian block of 60-90 minutes, works in two ways. First, the boundary feels safe to the brain. You're not promising to grind until exhaustion, only until the timer rings. That reduces resistance. Second, science shows these blocks align with natural focus cycles or ultradian rhythms. Neuroscience voices like Andrew Huberman reinforce this. Concentrated effort followed by deliberate rest matches how the brain genuinely performs at its best. The payoff is sharper focus, less mental drag, and tasks that feel achievable instead of endless. Circadian timing is another recalibration. Your energy doesn't stay flat throughout the day, it ebbs and peaks. Most people are sharper in the late morning and early evening, naturally aligned with biological rhythms. Yet many try to force demanding work at their lowest points, late afternoon for instance, when focus predictably slumps. By aligning your hardest tasks with natural peaks, You respect the system rather than fight it. Neurochemistry rewards that respect with improved efficiency. What might take 3 hours of forcing in a dead zone could shrink to 1 hour in a peak zone, with less strain attached. Novelty also serves as a reset tool. Rather than letting random distractions intrude, you can insert intentional pattern breaks. Move for a few minutes, change the lighting in your space, listen to a new song, even take a quick walk. The brain favors novelty. It re-engages circuits dulled by repetition. This is what we might call positive interruption. Instead of distractions stealing attention, you design resets that refresh it. Without that, your energy declines steadily until you burn out. With deliberate novelty, you curve the line upward again. To visualize this, picture your brain like a smartphone with far too many apps open in the background. Notifications ping, games run half-loaded, updates refresh constantly. Nothing crashes outright, but the phone gets slower until every action drags. That is essentially task-switching costs inside a human brain. Closing just a few tabs, mindfully removing some of those drain points, can restore speed almost instantly. The difference isn't willpower, it's system load. Micro-actions make these hacks stick. 3 stand out. First, set one time box today, 25 minutes minimum, with all other tabs and notifications closed. Second, put your phone on Do Not Disturb for at least 1 cycle. That preserves dopamine for the one task instead of scattering it. Third, schedule your hardest task during your natural peak. If that means shifting deep work to 10 a.m. instead of 4 p.m., you'll notice the speed difference immediately. These steps require almost no planning, but they reroute entire days. Case examples make the point clearer. One person who committed to 25-minute blocks early in the morning discovered the day felt lighter overall, even though the workload hadn't changed. Because residue didn't pile so heavily, they finished key tasks faster and carried none of the mental fog into the evening. Another person shifted their writing practice from late evening to mid-morning. The difference wasn't in what they wrote, it was in how long it took. What once stretched painfully across 2 hours compressed into 40 minutes, and fatigue lifted. These are not massive reinventions, they are neuroscience-aligned timing adjustments that compound daily. What emerges from this reframing is a simple truth. Focus is not strictly mental toughness. It's chemistry designed to work in rhythms. Build your structure around those rhythms and suddenly productivity feels smoother, not because you became stronger, but because you stopped fighting cycles that already existed. Redirect dopamine instead of depleting it. Limit switches to stop bleeding accuracy. Match tasks to peaks instead of valleys. Introduce novelty resets instead of random interruptions. When habits align with wiring, resistance decreases on its own. And there's another layer worth noticing. Even if you manage dopamine cycles, minimize switch costs, and design your day around ultradian rhythms, you still face one stubborn barrier. The physical environment around you, the desk, the lighting, the sound, the chair, quietly anchors stuckness in ways that chemistry alone can't fix. Anyone who has tried working from bed knows this. The body associates that space with sleep, so productivity collapses regardless of intention. Which leads to the next essential question. Why does the very place where you spend your days so often drain you, even when you haven't done much at all? When your environment holds you hostage. When your environment holds you hostage, it doesn't come with visible chains. Instead, it nudges, cues, and instructs your nervous system in ways easy to miss. You sit all day at home, barely move, tell yourself you've rested, yet by night you feel depleted. That isn't laziness. It's your surroundings whispering signals on repeat. Spaces aren't neutral backdrops. They reinforce who you think you are and what state your body believes it should occupy. The wrong cues leak energy the entire day, before anything significant even happens. Light is usually the first cue, and one of the hardest to ignore. Dim or uneven lighting tells the body, time to wind down, even if you're supposed to be energized. That's why working in a dark corner at 10 a.m. feels like dragging through mud. On the other hand, exposure to natural light or a daylight lamp stimulates alertness through circadian rhythm alignment. Research confirms the effect. People who work near daylight report higher productivity and better mood. The actionable move here is obvious. Experiment with shifting your desk nearer to a window, or, if natural light is limited, invest in a daylight mimicking lamp. Try this for 7 days, then track whether your energy through the afternoon holds longer before crashing. Noise is the second anchor, and it works even when you claim you're tuning it out. low hums, traffic, or the apartment upstairs moving constantly, that background never becomes silent for the nervous system. Instead, those sounds run in parallel to your conscious focus, pulling a percentage of energy away all day. Over hours, the effect matches a computer draining battery with hidden apps. Remote work conditions make it worse. In blended spaces, the same sound cues blur professional focus with home life, so you're never fully at work or at rest. The experiment here is simple. Use noise-canceling headphones, play white noise, or carve one consistent hour where the environment goes quiet. Do it for a week and see if your focus feels steadier. The third invisible drain is clutter. The unfinished projects, stacks of mail, laundry waiting in corners, these each reinforce unconscious to-do lists. They don't yell at you, but they hum in the background with messages like, "Something here is incomplete." Without realizing it, your nervous system fragments attention just by sitting in the presence of those cues. What feels like ordinary mess becomes heavy mental bandwidth. An easy intervention: clear a 2-foot radius around your main workspace. You don't need to become minimalist. Just carve one clean space where your brain isn't juggling dozens of silent reminders. For 7 days, start work only when that 2-foot area is reset. Notice how much lighter the mind feels when the clutter stops whispering. Taken together, light, noise, and clutter shape the entire tone of a day. And yet most people never test their effect. They assume exhaustion is about workload while ignoring that the room itself has been recruiting their energy all along. This isn't philosophical, it's everyday biology. Light regulates circadian chemicals. Noise stresses the system subtly and continually. Clutter fragments cognitive load. Adjust these three, even minimally, and you begin to see how energy wasn't missing inside you. It was leaking through the environment. The pandemic-era shift into remote work highlighted this more clearly than ever. Gallup data show that many remote-capable workers still prefer hybrid arrangements, reporting higher engagement when flexibility exists. But research also found that 25% of fully remote workers report loneliness versus 16% of fully on-site staff. Similar surveys from OWL Labs and PwC show employees crave flexibility, but often report growing fatigue in fully remote setups. Autonomy was supposed to be energizing, yet absent intentional redesign of environment, freedom turned into constant drain. The lesson is direct. Choice of location matters less than whether the location itself sends coherent, supportive signals. Anchoring explains why environments matter at such depth. Each place encodes repeated behaviors into habit. Think of gyms as energy cues, libraries as concentration cues. Home spaces, when blurred, encode mixed signals. A dining table doubling as desk, a bed doubling as office, a living room serving both relaxation and work. It collapses associations until the nervous system concludes only one thing: fatigue lives here. Routines get stuck not because you lack discipline, but because the room has silently programmed your state. The encouraging part is how small experiments shift that programming quickly. Move a desk to face a window. Test a white noise app during a call. Clear a specific patch of clutter each day before tasks. For at least a week, run these as structured experiments instead of hopeful one-offs. Track your energy patterns, even noting changes in mood or decision-making speed, and you'll likely see that minor shifts rewire the cues your system takes from space. To make it even more concrete, try one memorable challenge. For 2 hours this week, work from a completely different spot: a cafe, a library, even another corner of your apartment. Don't analyze during, just notice after. Did time pass more easily? Did fatigue arrive later? Was focus sharper? Environments hold strong influence, but testing them for yourself proves the point more powerfully than theory. And if you discover even one small difference, you'll have clear evidence that your surroundings were holding more sway than you thought. The environment is not a passive backdrop. It generates state, reinforces identity, and either sustains energy or bleeds it away. Light cues your rhythm. Noise pulls unseen bandwidth. Clutter multiplies reminders you never finished. Each of these can hold you hostage, yet each can also release you with minor, deliberate updates. Not through massive renovation or relocation, but through structured trials repeated steadily. When you set new signals, environments start working for you instead of against you. Yet even when external space shifts, another dimension keeps people bound. Many find themselves improving their workspace, adjusting light or noise, yet still anchored to jobs or relationships that don't serve them. The environment can drain, but so can the invisible weight of commitments that once promised stability. And often what feels hardest isn't leaving something broken, it's leaving something that looks comfortable enough to stay. Escape routes from career and relationship traps. Golden handcuffs are rarely about money or romance alone. They're the invisible anchors inside careers and relationships that no longer bring energy yet feel hard to leave. On the surface, situations like a well-paying but uninspiring job or a partnership that's lost its spark look secure. They provide structure, stability, and identity. Underneath, they create the kind of quiet bind that convinces you staying is safer than the unknown, even when part of you longs for change. These traps are not just about circumstance, they're about how the mind calculates risk. Two mental patterns drive the stuckness. The first is the sunk cost fallacy, the belief that because you've already invested years, money, or effort, you must continue, even if the investment no longer pays off today. The second is loss aversion, the tendency to fear giving up what you currently hold more than you anticipate the gain that could replace it. These two together make walking away from draining paths feel like irrational loss, even when staying ensures further depletion. Careers often illustrate this most clearly. People stay in roles they dislike because of the degree they earned, the years already spent, or the retirement track they believe must be protected. Relationships show the same pattern in subtler ways. Partners who privately admit the connection feels thin but hold tight to the history, the shared milestones, or the children that make moving on seem unthinkable. None of those considerations are trivial. Finances and family matter deeply. Yet they can also serve as camouflage for the mental loops that say, "I can't leave," when the deeper truth is I'm unwilling to risk loss. The issue isn't loyalty, it's the calculation system. A way forward begins with practical escape routes that reduce fear rather than demanding immediate rupture. One tool is the parallel tracks approach. Rather than quitting outright, you build a second path alongside your current commitments. That can mean setting aside 1 hour per week for exploratory projects or reaching out for one 30-minute conversation with a professional in a different field each week. Over months, these parallel tracks accumulate into real footholds. They offer proof that possibility exists beyond your current lane, without demanding that you tear down the existing one overnight. In relationships, the equivalent is a trial separation in miniature, not an abrupt split, but structured experiments in independence. That might mean blocking off one evening per week to focus fully on personal projects, or negotiating clear time apart to test how identity expands outside of shared patterns. For some, this creates fresh energy that circles back into the partnership. For others, it confirms that growth requires a new direction. Either way, the experiment shifts the story from fear of leaving to curiosity about multiple possible futures. The pressure lessens because nothing final is demanded up front. Why emphasize small, cautious steps? Because statistics suggest that many people already face high emotional load. Mental Health America's 2024 data showed nearly 78% of individuals who completed their screenings scored in the moderate to severe range for symptoms like anxiety and depression. Meanwhile, CDC reporting has tracked rises in depression prevalence of more than 60% over the past decade. In light of that, demanding instant upheaval may be unrealistic, even unsafe. Micro-experiments support progress without adding crushing risk in lives already carrying heavy weight. Take the example of someone who stayed in the same corporate role for 12 years, drained but unsure how to leave. Instead of resigning, they dedicate an evening per week to freelance projects in their field of interest. 6 months later, those projects form a portfolio. A few informational calls expand into a small network. Eventually, opportunities open that never would have appeared without those early micro steps. On the outside, nothing dramatic seemed to happen, no sudden quit, no grand declaration. Yet in reality, the escape route was already building underneath. Or picture a couple who set aside one evening per week where each partner pursues a solo passion project without interruption. At first it looks minor, just 2 or 3 hours of different space. But those small changes lighten pressure, renew curiosity, and allow each person to return to the relationship with different energy. In some situations, that renewal is enough to restore connection. In others, it clarifies that each may need different paths. Either way, the decision comes with more grounding, less panic, and clearer options. Escaping these loops isn't a matter of bravery alone. It's about clarity of accounting. You see that sunk cost doesn't dictate future worth. You understand that loss aversion tricks the story into making stability sound protective even when it erodes vitality. From there, you practice movements small enough to be safe, but steady enough to add up. In doing so, you discover that escape isn't leaping off a cliff. It's building a bridge slowly across. None of this erases very real constraints. Children need care, bills must be paid, mortgages hold long timelines. Supportive escape routes honor those constraints rather than pretending they don't matter. The key is distinguishing between practical responsibilities and disguised loops. Responsibilities guide you to balance. Loops keep you locked when alternatives could be built. Step by step, carving a few hours, making exploratory calls, protecting solo time. This is how many people begin without destabilizing what matters most. If you want to make this concrete now, try this. Choose one micro-experiment this week. Either schedule a call with someone outside your industry or set aside an evening solely for a personal pursuit that expands your independence. Then type that small action into the comments. Declaring it doesn't bind you to anything irreversible. It affirms that you can begin shifting without tearing down what matters. That written step creates accountability and proof of momentum where before there seemed to be none. As you build these pathways, something subtle begins to happen. The fear of emptiness softens. What once looked like an endless void gradually reveals itself as open space, space where possibility waits to be shaped. And as you keep practicing small routes outward, the old narrative loses its solidity. The handcuffs don't dissolve all at once, but their grip weakens as new options stabilize in parallel. You're not stuck forever, you're still building. And at a certain point, discovery itself becomes the momentum. You're no longer paralyzed by the question, should I stay or should I go? You're absorbed in the process of creating evidence that alternatives are real. That evidence is what shifts perception, rewiring the mind toward expansion rather than fear. Once you see the map is larger than the narrow hallway you imagined, energy returns almost by itself. What follows next is learning a structured way to activate that momentum in real time. It requires turning awareness into an actual state shift you can feel as it happens. Because once you experience movement inside your nervous system, small experiments stop being theory and become lived proof that change is possible. The quantum activation process. The next shift is what I call the quantum activation process. It isn't abstract and it isn't about lofty theory. This is a structure you can run in real time, one you can feel in your nervous system as it happens. At its core, it's 3 steps you repeat again and again until they begin to replace old patterns: awareness, energy shift, decision. Simple words, but when applied deliberately, they break loops that used to feel permanent. Without them, change remains a good idea on paper. With them, change becomes a lived act you can perform at any moment. The first stage is awareness. Everything begins here. You catch the loop as it runs, a thought telling you there are no options, the way your hand moves automatically to check a screen, that familiar hesitation before any new attempt. Instead of letting it slide beneath notice, you watch it. This is observation in action. Neuroscience calls this interrupting automaticity, a conscious pause that breaks the circuit before it completes. Nothing has to fix itself immediately. Simply seeing the pattern pulls you out of autopilot and repositions you as an observer. That small shift marks the first crack in sameness. The second stage is energy shift. Neural loops thrive because they're glued into place by the body's state, the way you breathe, the tension in your muscles, the tight emotional posture that locks thought and chemistry together. To weaken a loop, you don't debate it endlessly, you alter the state that feeds it. That's why breathwork works. A deep inhale through the nose, a short hold, and an exhale slightly longer than your inhale changes the balance in your autonomic nervous system, cooling the stress signals that keep the loop intact. Or movement. Standing up, shaking out your arms, even walking across the room resets posture, which shifts the physical anchor of the loop. Visualization works too. Picturing yourself in another space or scenario obliges the brain to recruit alternate pathways. Research shows tiny breaks in state reduce cognitive switch costs that normally drain you after task changes. The key isn't sophistication, it's intention. State shifted, chemistry interrupted. The third stage is decision. Awareness exposed the loop. Energy shift loosened its grip. Now comes the act of collapsing a different outcome into place. Neuroscience gives this stage its teeth. Every time you make a new choice and act on it, you reinforce fresh neural pathways. These pathways matter because they expand through repetition. What you choose now literally wires easier access for later. This is neuroplasticity made practical, and the choice doesn't have to be monumental. It can be as small as typing one line into a draft, walking around the block instead of scrolling, sending one short message you've put off. Each decision contradicts the old pattern and drops proof into the nervous system. Over time, evidence stacks and identity starts to tilt away from I'm stuck into I move. Let's run a quick activation now so you can feel the process in under a minute. First, awareness. Bring to mind one small loop that tends to repeat. Maybe hesitation before you speak up or fatigue when you sit to do important work. Name it silently. Second, energy shift. Close your eyes for a moment if possible. Inhale deeply through the nose. Hold gently for 2 seconds. Exhale slowly through the mouth, longer than the inhale. Repeat this breath 3 times. As you do, notice your body subtly releasing tension. That is your nervous system exiting the old state. Third, decision. While in this calmer baseline, pick one small action you will take in the next 24 hours that contradicts the loop. Keep it practical. One message, one 5-minute step, one changed behavior you can guarantee tomorrow. That's your decision. Right now, you have run one completed cycle of the activation process. Here's where I want to invite you into a micro commitment. Type that simple chosen action into the comments. Don't overthink it. Just put into words the small decision you picked. Writing it creates accountability and, just as importantly, proves to your own brain that you already started. That act shifts you out of passive listening and into lived practice. You're collapsing possibility into evidence on the spot. At first glance, awareness, energy shift, and decision may seem too simple to matter, but each stage rests on clear neuroscience. Awareness interrupts automaticity, the cycle of unconscious repetition. Energy shifting changes autonomic states, disrupting the chemistry feeding the loop. Decision encodes new neural pathways, stacking proof until the brain rewires itself to treat change as familiar. This isn't about giant transformation at once, it's about building a repeatable tool. 3 steps that can run in less than 60 seconds, wherever you are, as many times as you need. The repetition is what gives it weight. Do it once and you get a glimpse. Do it daily and you begin to lay down new grooves. Awareness trained consistently heightens perception. State-shifting practices build flexibility into the nervous system. Small decisions, repeated, compound into large changes across weeks and months. At that scale, it stops being a trick and becomes a framework for how you navigate life. What was once paralysis shifts into a reliable operating system for momentum. The quantum metaphor adds clarity to this shift. Imagine multiple versions of you branching forward from this moment, one continuing the old routine for another year, another redirecting into different work, another exploring creativity in ways you've delayed. All those timelines remain possibilities until choice collapses one into the present. If you don't intervene, the brain defaults to the familiar collapse. It plays the old version on repeat. This activation sequence hands you back the lever. Awareness keeps the field open. Energy shift disrupts the old collapse. Decision places weight on the new line. Over time, each cycle closes into a fresh timeline where freedom feels closer, not distant. The most important factor is execution, not scale. Done in micro moments, the activation keeps proving itself. You resist sending a message? Notice it, shift breath. Send the message anyway. Loop interrupted. You want to write but feel flat? Notice the hesitation. Shift posture. Commit to one sentence. Loop interrupted. These aren't dramatic leaps forward, but they are measurable disruptions that accumulate into rewired patterns. Gradually, the system learns that expansion is an option, not a threat. That shift in perception is everything. You aren't waiting for an external breakthrough. You're training your own circuitry to register possibility as normal. Once traced over and over, new grooves replace the old, until stuck becomes harder to sustain than movement. This is activation working exactly as designed. It's direct, brief, and endlessly repeatable. And with this practice in place, another insight appears. Stuckness doesn't present itself the same way for everyone. The loops anchor in different domains. Sometimes they center on career, sometimes on location, sometimes in relationship, sometimes in creativity itself. Each domain asks for its own specific strategies once you've accepted that activation is possible. What matters next is learning the practical hacks that target whichever version of stuckness shows up most strongly in your life. Productivity hacks for every type of stuck. Different kinds of stuckness demand different tools. Think of this as a practical toolbox, specific hacks designed to match the context you're in. Career stressors need one set of adjustments, location fatigue another, relationship loops another, and creative paralysis yet another. Each hack is small, direct, and repeatable. The value isn't in adding dozens of hacks all at once. It's in picking the precise one that fits the loop you want to interrupt. Start with careers, where loops often feel most suffocating. 2 hacks matter here. First, networking activation. Schedule one 30-minute conversation per week with someone outside your immediate environment. This works because it introduces novelty into your professional network, helping the brain access new perspectives instead of recycling the same occupational bubble. The payoff is fresh openings, new tools, unexpected insights, sometimes even opportunities you weren't aware existed. Second, a skills sprint. Dedicate 10 hours per month to learning one new skill directly adjacent to your current work. That could mean trying an online design module, practicing data analysis basics, or experimenting with public speaking drills. 10 hours is short enough to avoid burnout, but long enough to build neuroplasticity. The brain registers novelty, reinforces fresh grooves, and reignites momentum in environments that otherwise feel stagnant. Location is another anchor that quietly drains energy. When every wall, street, and chair repeats the same story, the nervous system tightens into sameness. 2 simple hacks disrupt this. First, workspace rotation. Once a week, move tasks to a different setting, a library, cafe, co-working spot, or even another room in your apartment. The brain responds to environmental novelty with shifts in focus and mood, creating the sense of a reset without requiring relocation. Second, micro-orientation shifts. If you can't leave your usual space, pivot your desk to face a window, change the seating position, or switch lighting for one work cycle. These cues refresh perception and signal to the nervous system. New state. The result is more creativity and energy in spaces that used to feel oppressive. Relationships bring stuckness in the form of repetitive dialogue, arguments that spiral into the same endings, or silence that drags on unknown. 2 targeted hacks help. First, conscious scripts. Have 2 or 3 written lines prepared to break a loop. For instance, instead of simmering in silence, try, "Something feels stuck between us, and I'd like us to explore it together." These scripts stop autopilot communication and redirect energy toward honesty. Second, reflective listening sessions. Once a week, set aside 20 minutes where each person speaks without interruption and the other mirrors back what they heard. This counteracts defensive loops by slowing pace and validating perception. The brain learns a new pattern of dialogue, less reflexive, more intentional, which resets the relationship's emotional circuit. Creativity stuckness might be the heaviest of all because it often comes with shame, blank screens, half-finished drafts, abandoned projects. 2 hacks shift that weight. First, ritualized warm-ups. Begin with 3 minutes of nonsense creation, scribbles, random sentences, loose sketches. These warm-ups tell the nervous system it's time to enter generative mode without demanding perfection. Neuroscience shows that action precedes inspiration. The act itself recruits the networks that make flow possible. Second, output quota. Set a non-negotiable minimum, like writing 100 words daily or producing 1 sketch per week, without regard for quality. By lowering pressure, you condition the brain to treat creation as routine rather than crisis. Over time, the act of showing up reduces the paralysis that comes from perfectionism. Some hacks lean into humor, but require careful framing. For example, temporarily changing your Wi-Fi password forces disconnection and creates urgent focus. But this should only be for those comfortable with dramatic steps. For many, a safer and equally effective alternative is enabling app timers or using do not disturb schedules. Research on remote work highlights that frequent digital notifications increase stress and mental fatigue. Tools that cut back interruptions give the nervous system room to restore focus without requiring extreme measures. A 7-day test with timed app usage often shows measurable increases in attention and lower levels of burnout. Across these domains, a clear pattern emerges. Career hacks center around broadening networks and skills, expanding the mental loops that narrowed. Location hacks disturb environmental sameness so that perception resets. Relationship hacks break the rhythm of repetitive communication through scripted openings and timed reflection. Creativity hacks bypass pressure by lowering the threshold for entry and priming action before inspiration. Digital discipline supports them all by removing distraction costs that scatter motivation. In each case, the principle is identical. Use small, precise interventions to introduce novelty and free energy previously bound up in sameness. What matters is not loading yourself with dozens of practices, but choosing the hack that meets your current environment. If your job feels small, one new 30-minute conversation a week can widen perspective. If your room feels heavy, a rotation into different light cues immediate difference. If your partner feels unreachable, one prepared script resets the dynamic. If your notebook is blank, a warm-up ritual clears the pressure. These don't promise overnight reinvention. They guarantee traction, which is what stuckness most resists. Think of the hacks as a rotating belt of tools. Each day calls for a different grip. Some mornings you may need skill practice to kickstart career mobility. Other weeks, rotating to a cafe breaks the loop of home fatigue. Conflict rising, the conscious script restores balance. Blank page looming, warm-ups carry you into momentum. Productivity isn't about superhuman willpower, it's about holding these tools and reaching for them when you feel the loop reassert itself. Over time, the brain begins to anticipate this adaptability. Instead of defaulting to panic or resignation when stuckness appears, you feel equipped. That shift in perception is what matters most, knowing that you have options. Loops collapse fastest when you know they're not absolute, only waiting to be interrupted. And this leads to something deeper. Hacks give traction, but sometimes the actual breakthrough feels like it arrives in a sudden flash, as though all that effort suddenly transforms into a different state at once. Moments like that can feel mysterious, but they often follow long periods of stuckness. The suddenness isn't magic, it's how change accumulates until the system flips. Knowing why those moments feel instantaneous, after months of slow work, reveals what real transformation looks like in practice. From phase transition to flow. Sometimes a turning point feels like it comes out of nowhere, a shift so sudden it catches even you by surprise. This is what we can call moving from phase transition to flow. For months or even years, you might push against the same limits, trying small shifts with little visible reward. Then, in what looks like a single moment, the barrier yields. The principle behind this is not luck or accident, it's the same structure seen in nature, where systems absorb energy silently until they cross a threshold. Ice holds its shape until just enough heat dissolves it into water. Water sits still until it boils. A threshold is reached and the state flips. Human momentum functions the same way. Consider one clear example. A person sits in a career that feels flat, their energy drained day after day. They scroll job boards, sketch out new resumes, speak vaguely with friends about alternatives. None of these actions deliver immediate change, so they assume nothing is working. Yet under the surface, each act deposits energy into the system. Then, one morning, they finally answer a message about a role forwarded by a colleague. That response leads to a quick conversation, then an interview, then an offer on the table. From outside, it seems like an overnight shift. In reality, the transition had been heating for weeks or months, waiting for the final spark. This is what phase transition teaches. Progress often looks invisible until the exact instant of release. The blank pages a writer stares at, the draft sketches that go nowhere, the stalled rehearsals of a musician, all appear empty at the time. Later, those same people pour out work so quickly it shocks even them. To outsiders, it looks like sudden inspiration. To neuroscience, it looks like a buildup of connections finally surpassing threshold. Neuroplasticity research confirms this. The brain often requires repeated exposure and failed attempts before reorganizing into a new, more efficient pathway. Preparation looks like stagnation until the pathway stabilizes, then flow unlocks. Two practical takeaways emerge once you accept this pattern. First, persistent small actions always count. The phone call that doesn't go anywhere, the short practice session that feels wasted, the mini draft that lands in the trash, they are not failures. They are stored energy. Each act thickens the wiring in your brain, priming it to transform. The most useful reframe is to treat these as deposits instead of losses, reminders that growth builds beneath the surface even when you can't see the balance increase. Second, understand the danger of quitting too close to the threshold. Like turning off the stove just before water boils, stepping away when frustration peaks cancels the process before payoff. One preventative method is the 7-day perseverance rule. When you hit a wall, commit to keeping one micro shift alive for a single week. Maybe that's 15 minutes of writing daily or one small outreach attempt. 7 days is long enough to test whether momentum unlocks, short enough that resistance doesn't feel unbearable. Many breakthroughs report arriving not long after people nearly gave up, because the system was already near saturation. This doesn't mean glorify the waiting. It means reframe stagnation. Instead of calling it failure, treat it as heating. A direct line you can use in those moments is, "This is energy building, not proof I'm stuck." Remind yourself each microaction compounds. Even if your metrics don't show results yet, the fuel is accumulating toward a threshold. That's how flow emerges, not from random bursts of inspiration, but from months of deposits suddenly released at once. This framework eases the weight people carry when they assume they're broken. The heaviness you feel may not be proof of incapacity. It may be the pressure of stored energy building inside a system approaching conversion. That perspective changes psychology. Instead of despairing over lack of visible results, you understand that unseen heat is rising beneath the surface. The quiet days, the routines that look pointless, the repeated attempts that fail, all of them are part of the physics of transition. It also explains why once momentum clicks, it accelerates so quickly. A writer who sat in silence for weeks may suddenly turn out chapters daily. An individual inert in their career may take 3 leaps forward in a month after years of deliberation. Flow looks miraculous only to those who didn't observe the slow saturation underneath. Once the threshold tips, the energy does trickle, it pours. Here, research gives reassurance. Studies on learning and neuroplasticity show that breakthroughs rarely arrive instantly. They come after long runs of practice where little progress was detectable. Then, as pathways strengthen behind the scenes, performance spikes sharply. What looks like plateau followed by leap is built into the biology of learning. That applies as much to personal transformation as it does to technical skills. Seeing yourself in this light removes some urgency. You're not wasting time during periods where nothing moves. You're collecting energy for the point where movement flips from impossible to automatic. The patience this requires is not passive. It's active waiting, supported by micro shifts and steady inputs that fuel the eventual release. Imagine this concretely. You're tempted to abandon the practice because progress seems invisible. Instead, you revisit the 7-day rule. Commit to one microshift daily for a week, stand during a meeting, change one workspace cue, write one paragraph, or block a 30-minute slot for exploration. This isn't about scale, it's about evidence. Over that week, watch for tiny signs of traction, a smoother sentence, a lighter mood, a new contact returned. Each is proof the system is heating. The shift may not tip yet, but the boiling point is closer than it looks. The mindset adjustment here is simple, though not easy. Instead of dramatizing delay, you interpret it as temperature rising. Replace "I'm failing to change" with "I'm building pressure toward transition." This new frame offers psychological breathing room. It lowers despair and sustains energy just long enough to carry you across the threshold. And when you do cross, the flow doesn't feel tentative, it feels self-sustaining. That's the paradox. The same state that once felt frozen bursts into acceleration, not in small increments but in large surges. This is a property of systems under pressure. The struggle was never devoid of meaning. It was the furnace in which momentum condensed. So the task becomes survival until the flip. Build the deposits, notice the heating, refuse early abandonment, and prepare for a shift that looks abrupt only in its timing. Flow is the natural next phase in a process that has been unfolding silently beneath the visible surface. Carrying this understanding changes how you view your own cycle. Each pause, each struggle, Each moment of restlessness can be treated as evidence of energy consolidating, not evidence of failure. And once you start holding stagnation in that new light, you make peace with the invisible part of growth. You don't have to see water boiling to know it's getting hotter. You don't have to see immediate results to know your small actions are igniting the wiring that makes breakthroughs possible. And standing inside that perspective reframes your entire story. The weight you felt wasn't wasted, it was preparation. The pressure you carried wasn't punishment, it was signal. The boiling point isn't somewhere far away, it builds with every small, unseen act. Flow follows saturation. Transition creates release. And when it comes, you'll see that what looked like stuckness was already the start of movement. That's the shift worth carrying forward now. Every loop that feels immovable hides the potential for release. Every stalled day is an unmeasured deposit. And every point of resistance is heat in the system, preparing the leap that reconfigures your direction. Stuckness isn't absence, it's buildup. And when that buildup tips, momentum arrives with its own force, carrying you to the place that once felt unreachable. Which raises a final reflection. If stuckness is only ever stored energy preparing the next transition, what story have you been telling yourself about standing still? That story may be the last anchor to release. Because once you see the stasis as preparation, you realize something profound has been true all along. Conclusion means turning everything we've covered into action, right now. What felt like stuckness was never proof that you were broken. It was a system holding tension until you chose to release it. Each hesitation, each cycle, each wave of frustration was untapped energy waiting to be directed. So here's your closing activation. In the next hour, stand up, take 3 deep breaths, and write down one small decision you'll act on today. That is awareness, energy shift, and decision in its simplest form. Share your chosen word in the comments, and if this helped, like and subscribe to keep momentum alive.